Superman and Batman are like the two best friends who always end up slapboxing each other whenever they get a bit too tipsy. They're pretty much the comic book version of the emo kid and the Hello Kitty kid who inexplicably get along, but I want to figure out what connects these two characters on a deeper level than just the fact that they both have a mother named Martha. Why do such conflicting personalities end up fitting so well together whenever they represent such different versions of heroism? That's the point of the video, that's what we're looking at today. I know that the last video was also about superheroes and about comic books, but this is not a comic book channel. I just had some stuff left over that I wanted to kind of put back into the conversation. I think it's pretty interesting. And by looking at Superman and Batman as character types, we can actually trace out a pretty interesting dichotomy for the philosophy of heroism through Friedrich Nietzsche. So let's cover Superman first, and we can cover him where he got his initial success in what was known as the golden age of comics, in like the 1930s to the 1950s-ish. Comic books before that period were kind of just these newspaper funny sections of like, Garfield-esque comics or political cartoons about politicians who had fucked up that week. But the golden age saw comics begin to publish full stories in their own weekly issues, revolving around a number of genres, from cowboys to soldiers, even to romance stories. And obviously one of the main attractions was the newly introduced superhero, who was this superpowered individual who fought a weekly bad guy and saved the day. This was not just a small industry either. Comic books became a publishing powerhouse, selling 70 to 100 million copies monthly in the 1950s in America. That meant that half of the population of the US was buying a comic book of some kind every month, and the superhero was at the center of this. Unsurprisingly, it wasn't long before some people started to look at comic books and wanting to understand what made them so interesting for people. And one of those writers was called Umberto Eco, an Italian writer who wrote a lot about meaning and symbology and all this kind of stuff. He specifically wrote an article in which he explained why he thought Superman represented a departure from the usual story of the superhero that had been told up to this point. Eco thought that the golden age of superheroes, exemplified by Superman, brought together two types of storytelling, the mythical and the typical story. Each had their own distinctive way of telling a story about the hero, because the mythical hero had powers that were beyond the grasp of the normal person, but were powers we all wished we did have, even if sometimes the lesson of those stories was about how dangerous those powers might be. Just think of Hercules with his unimaginable strength, Thor with his control of lightning, Poseidon having this control over the sea. These were within the reach of our imaginations, but beyond the grasp of our reality. The typical hero was different. The typical hero from like the Victorian age, such as Sherlock Holmes, were these extreme realizations of natural traits. So they kind of remained in a typical grounding. So whenever we talk about Sherlock Holmes, his superpower was like, just a keen observation, which isn't necessarily unimaginable and also not unreachable. It was actually a very typical packaging for a hero. We could even look at someone, say, like Jekyll and Hyde as well, who was basically just a bloke who's a little bit aggressive and probably could bench more than the average Victorian man, but he wasn't necessarily superpowered, he wasn't the Hulk. But then came along superheroes, embodying the unthinkable powers of the mythical hero every average citizen aspired to, but also he had this secret identity which made him a typical person at the same time. With the dual character of Clark Kent being an average and kind of despised working man in contrast to Superman being the absolute peak of humanity and loved by everyone. And this dichotomy is almost brought to an extreme with Clark Kent, usually being portrayed as this ridiculously normal guy, while Superman has these near godlike powers. Eco believed that this new superhero was a consequence of the industrial society at the time, which was structured around office work and labor within big cities that placed the working man in pretty menial positions. The modern superhero then was not just a cool idea, but compensated for the believed inadequacies of the average working man in the workforce, who had lost their identity and some of their agency, meaning the protagonist in the superhero tale became this wish fulfillment for the average guy. The average man identified with Clark Kent, but wished to be Superman. But this mythical, typical superhero ends up combining not only the characters, but the storytelling of both the mythical and typical tales. So first, the classical mythical story was set in the past and told with a definitive beginning and ending. These weren't weekly adventures. These stories were told as if they happened long ago and were told over and over again through the oral tradition with great reverence. These characters were being viewed as larger than life, but this did also mean that they had a predictable nature where everyone kind of knew what was going to happen in their story. Even in the stories themselves, they usually had prophecies or a fate being laid out at the beginning and being inescapable for the character. But this predictable nature meant that they were able to continuously re-establish universal concepts, which was fundamental to the story. That meant that the hero's tale, in this case, was able to tell a greater point through its retelling over and over again. And especially in a period where there was no mass media, there's no newspaper, there's no television programs to teach you about the world around you, these stories acted as being able to teach you something about the world or something about society on a greater level, which was possible at a time where media was really limited. However, we deal with a different story in the novels which portrayed the typical hero. So novels became more popular around the 18th century outside of just rich people, and the novels ended up with characters whose storylines were generally told as currently happening, as opposed to the myth, which was a story that had already happened. And due to the fact that the novel was telling a current ongoing story, it was very much focused on unpredictable, undetermined events, unlike the mythical tale, which was retold and everyone kind of knew the ending already. And by the 19th century, many of the traditional heroes like Sherlock Holmes or Charles Dickens characters were released in serialized parts and were dealing with more ongoing social issues rather than preaching about universal concepts. So the novel could now act as a reference point for everyone in society who was literate, as literacy grew even amongst, poorer people. Interestingly, actually, Charles Dickens' novels often actually critiqued illiteracy within the stories, and Dickens himself called for education reform to improve reading ability amongst the average person. Here we can see that the typical nature of the novel had been fully realized as it started to critique how society was, rather than just teaching you about how society is, far different from the myth of the past. And then we get to the superhero, whose character is both a typical person and a mythical figure at the same time. Clark Kent lives within our society, but is also this larger-than-life immortal superhero. And there we have the problem for the Superman writer. Superman has to remain immobile in his fixed mythical nature, but also has to move forward in time in his serialized weekly comic told in the modern day. You can't just retell Superman's origin story every week like you could with the myth, but also can't have him substantially change every week because you're in an era of mass production where the story needs to be accessible to the average reader. This is the dilemma for the superhero writer, who deals with a character who is both inconsumable to time, but is also forced to consume time every week. Well, the Superman writer solves this in a funny way by playing with the concept of time itself. For us, time is whatever comes before determining whatever comes after. We consume time in the present through our actions. We could say, if I do action A, then that provokes action B, then that provokes action C, and so on and so forth. As soon as I do action A, it's in the past, and I have no control over it anymore. I can only take a new action to address what's happened in the past. If I kick a policeman, I have to take an action, and I now have to deal with what happens after that. I have to deal with the consequences, either getting arrested or possibly putting on my running shoes. However, it's not like we're caught in a process of stuff just happening. We can plan our actions, we can shape our future, but this does mean that we weigh our decisions very heavily. No one wants to make a mistake, and it's annoying having to look back on our past actions sometimes, or maybe we have made mistakes. Superman writers treat time differently in their stories, though, by using a dreamlike structure. In the Golden Age Superman stories, there's a hazy line with what happened before the story began and what happened after the story ends. Just like how you never remember what happens before a dream or after a dream. This means that unlike our reality, the Superman story doesn't have to deal with past actions or future consequences. because they just end up getting lost in the haze between one issue and the next. That means the Superman comic book has to start and end in the same position every week, so that there's no dissonance between each comic book. Superman can't die at the end of one comic and then reappear alive at the beginning of the next, because this is just confusing for the reader. So this is how they get around the mythical, typical dilemma, by making it so that Superman always acts to bring his surroundings back to their starting point every issue. It's kind of like he acts to reset things. The story basically then follows this predictable pattern with only aesthetic differences. Every week, Clark Kent is at his job, then some new supervillain or disaster happens. Clark puts on his supersuit, defends whatever is troubling Metropolis, and then returns to his work as if nothing really happened. Reading a story like this gives the perception that you're always in the present, since no action has any real meaning. The superhero is almost caught in this terrifying Groundhog Day loop, where Superman is continually taking actions each week, with the previous week's actions being completely forgotten as soon as the action has been completed. It would drive anyone insane to actually be in such a scenario, where your actions are wholly meaningless. But we can put it another way, which might be a little bit more clear. As we went over before, for us in the real world, time moves like A to B to C to D to E in a kind of linear straight line. However, in the Superman story, A provokes B, B provokes C, C provokes D, but then D provokes A. As one story ends, and the following week the new one begins, as if the last story didn't really even happen. You can see here that the superhero truly lives in this loop. Let's say I'm on the street and I see a policeman. I then kick the policeman, I run from the policeman, who then arrests me. If I were in a story from the golden age of comics, the writers would have to make it so that the police release me for some reason, like, I don't know, not doing their paperwork right, so that then my story next week can end up in the same place I started, walking down the street. So a new story can happen next week without me having to deal with the consequences of my actions from the previous week. Now I can kick someone else with no one ever suspecting that I literally just kicked a police officer the previous week. This kind of storytelling always returns to the status quo at the start of the story. It's an essential part of ensuring that a new story can continue next week. And this has the side effect of removing any kind of planning from the superhero story. Superman never plans to fight a supervillain. The supervillain just shows up, and Superman returns things to how they were whenever the story started. Echo doesn't necessarily have an issue with this dreamlike storytelling, and points out it's been in popular media for some time. However, he points towards the tics of the characters in this style of storytelling as being something we need to be more aware of. And the character tics here refer to exactly what you're thinking about. It's things that the characters and stories do over and over again, almost compulsively. Think of Superman doing his twirly outfit change, or him lacking any riz with Lois Lane, and obviously the most beloved of all, the supervillain monologue. Echo notices that we start to focus more on those reoccurring tics, and actually start to enjoy the story because of those things, which happen every week. Kind of like meeting a familiar friend. Now, the tics themselves are not the issue, but the over-reliance upon them allows for a highly redundant message in stories. This dreamlike storytelling where people are attracted to the repetitive tics of characters don't have to provide any new meaning in their actual storylines or in the actual happenings of the story. The story can just repeat the same message over and over again in this highly redundant manner, but that's the thing. Instead of people getting bored by this repetition of meaning, some people will start reading these comics specifically for their reiterative nature. And again, Echo points to this industrial society, which has made values consumable, and whenever all these values start to change and nothing starts feeling secure or firm, because any value could be changed by it being unproductive to the market or it being unprofitable at the time, the narrative of redundancy, which keeps repeating itself in the superhero comics, becomes a brief respite from the constant change and provides the average man with a dream that they could be the powerful one in their surroundings. Why worry about your loss of agency when you have all this media that lets you imagine yourself as powerful and in control? And this narrative of redundancy might look relatively innocent, But Echo argues it's all about a matter of degrees. As a little bit is harmless, there's nothing wrong with wanting to consume a little bit of mindless media for, some time. But he's worried about an overgrowth of this narrative and culture, which means no new meaning becomes available in storytelling. In the case of the superhero golden age, the narrative structure was purely based on this reiterative messaging. Every week, Superman beats the baddie. Every week, Superman does the twirly outfit change. Every week, he puts on those dumb glasses to disguise himself. And every week, Clark gets rejected by Lois Lane. And consequently, a circular pedagogy is created. That's a difficult word to say. What we're really talking about here is just the fact that the superhero, with this repetitive cycle and the same meaning being hammered home again and again, is teaching you the same thing over and over again, like in the traditional myth, but instead this time it's masquerading in a typical fashion. It teaches the men who read it that they live in a continuous present in which they don't plan anything, and in which they can disregard the past and not think about the future. Because thinking about the past and thinking about the future, as we said before, can be a painful kind of thing to do whenever it weighs so heavily on us. This makes Superman as a hero the perfect civic consciousness, but he has no real political consciousness. He's a Boy Scout to the present status quo, but he's not a means for change for the future, as he acknowledges no larger systems at work and plans nothing in advance. But let's just kind of get to this idea of civic consciousness for a hero. Superman acts like the perfect civilian. He abides by the present rules, and he reinstates law and order while doing generally harmless good deeds, and is generally perceived to be kind and helpful, none of which is inherently wrong. He's conscious of his civic duty to maintain society as it is by beating the immediate evils which might disrupt the existing status quo. But this requires no planning, it just requires you to react to the current issue. Maybe this is why Superman can also seem a little bit boring at times. But what if a hero could do more than just keep order? What if the order is the thing which the superhero believes he needs to change? So Echo wrote his article, around like the 60s, 70s. So he was at the tail end of what was called the golden age of comics, and just at the beginning of the silver age, just after the comic book code changed this industry forever. That comic book code would somewhat decimate the industry as it was. And that's because there were questions surrounding the influence of comics upon children and teenagers, wondering if it was leading to a cultural decline, as we see about every 10 years from the older generation looking at the younger generation. So the comic book code was introduced, which limited the content allowed to be presented in comics. You can no longer present explicit violence, sex, drugs, or anything vaguely unsavory from this point on. Although the superhero story was not too affected by this necessarily, it did have quite an effect on other comic book genres, and the code kind of decimated a lot of them. This led to a lot of comic book shops closing. It meant that certain genres completely disappeared, and the circulation was declining year on year. However, a cultural revolution would occur in the 1980s, as pointed out by Marco Favaro. This came about with the introduction of the graphic novel and the anti-hero when we move into the Dark Age. As was said before, the Golden Age comics were built like a dream, but the graphic novel was a closed time period that had a definitive starting and ending point because they were limited runs which didn't last forever like the normal comic book series was meant to. Meaning that they took place in a typical setting where consequences were real, and that means it was now not necessary for them to have to return to the status quo in these stories. The comic book timeline worked like, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, A, B, C, D, going on forever. The graphic novel timeline was A to B to C to D, full stop. The time loop didn't have to exist for the graphic novel. Comics used to have to always leave things in the same place as they were in the beginning, but in the graphic novel with its closed time period, with a definitive beginning and ending, There was no need for the last action to lead into the first action. This means that the actions can occur in the graphic novel, which have lasting and real and even sometimes negative consequences. But not only can the graphic novel now change things for the character circumstances, it could now change things for wider structures, wider institutions, or even wider society in general within the story. Where the superhero was defined by its role as the status quo protector, the hero of the graphic novel could be defined by its fight against the status quo. They can now live in a society which they viewed as immoral or corrupted and actually fight against it. And due to the format difference with the graphic novel, you could have the city's conditions start in one place and have them be changed by the superhero by the end, meaning that the hero was actually providing a meaning to their actions, which had a consequence on the past, present, and the possible future. At the same time, this was a muddying of the waters for a genre which had such a clear line between good and evil beforehand. The hero used to come in and save the day against a definitive evil disrupting order, but now it was dealing with the grey areas, upon which they had to fight the status quo order to bring about the change in societal evils. Fighting evil now means disrupting order, and that means using methods that were not always socially acceptable by that order. Because even if society is unjust, it still has rules and orders to maintain. And here we can see this is the point where the superhero changes into the anti-hero. And Batman is an interesting example of this, because he once was a victim of this kind of dreamlike storytelling in the previous Golden Age, but in the Dark Age, he had a series of graphic novels where he started to look slightly more anti-heroic. These stories seemed to excel in the darker setting as Batman started to fight a corrupted Gotham which needed wider change. Oftentimes, these Batman stories forced us to deal with a moral quandary, like in the graphic novel The Killing Joke, when Batman is faced with the moral question as to whether he needs to finally kill the Joker to actually stop his reign of chaos. Batman in the story isn't just looking to return to a status quo, but has to make an actual decision, which he won't be able to take back. As soon as he kills the Joker, that is a past action which has happened. It's also a clear deviation from his own moral code, as he believed killing was definitively wrong. And the story ends with Batman likely having killed the Joker, an action distinctly anti-heroic. And here we see how the change between the comic and the graphic novel effectively mirrored the change between the myth and the typical novel. Much like the novel, the graphic novel could now respond to complex issues that just wasn't possible in the previous era where you had a singular issue to deal with the story. It had broken itself out of the time loop and allowed writers to now approach stories in a more complex manner with an even greater typical focus. The hero was no longer a pure civic consciousness. So here we can see the difference between Superman and Batman is a little bit deeper than just one wears black and the other wears red. But we can take this difference even further philosophically with the Nietzschean idea of the mask. And I should say, this is not me doing a reading of Nietzsche. This is me purely going off of what Marco Favaro's take on Nietzsche's mask is. I should maybe also clarify just one thing before going ahead. Nietzsche is one of the most talked about philosophers ever. He's been used for good, but he's also been used for very bad. Kind of like a German philosophical Kanye West. The dude made 808s and Zarathustra, but also said some very bad anti-Semitic things. But basically, as long as you use his ideas wisely, they can be very interesting and can shed light on things in an interesting manner. But anyway, the mask for Nietzsche is how humans deal with the realization that our pain is meaningless in a universe without God. People need to make their suffering have some kind of meaning, because an existence where suffering is both inevitable and meaningless would be maddening. So instead we create a mask which acts as a coping mechanism for this meaningless suffering. We create a new identity which covers up this horrible fear we have deep down of meaningless. This new identity is built off of our fears and insecurities about our meaningless existence and weighs us down. It's an identity that holds us back from our full potential, because it does not associate itself fully with the reality that we've come to see, the reality of a meaningless existence. And this mask could be a lot of things, but Nietzsche uses the example of religion, the mask of religion, where we create God to help us give our suffering meaning. But for him, it's just a plaster we put over an infection. It gives us the appearance that we have treated our problem, but it persists below the surface. And we see this within the superhero who is born of tragedy. Think of every superhero origin story, whether it's Uncle Ben dying due to Spider-Man's inaction, Iron Man realizing his weapons of war have killed people, the Hulk is caught in this nuclear blast and had a pretty fucked up childhood if you look into it. Through this tragedy, they adopt a mask which brings them some level of meaning to that harsh reality which they experienced. Yet they also retain the original identity which they once held before their realization of meaningless. Superman is a great example of this. Clark Kent assumed he was a human for most of his life, finds out about the great tragedy of his home world, which was destroyed meaninglessly, so provides himself meaning to that suffering by adopting an identity purely based on protecting his adopted new world. In Nietzschean terms, Clark Kent has undergone a part realization in his harsh reality through his new identity, which is in some part built off of the fears and insecurities from his previous life, which is why he retains the Clark Kent identity, but provides his suffering meaning through Superman. The superhero then maintains some part of himself within society through his normal life, and maintains that society which provides him with his greater meaning. Clark Kent tethers Superman to an identity which keeps him within society's moral order and system. For Nietzsche, Superman's civic consciousness maintains society as it is, but that is a half measure to his own realization of the meaninglessness of what's around him. But we can adopt a different kind of mask. We can adopt a mask with full knowledge of this reality we come to see. We can build an identity which is driven by creativity and inspiration, which a meaningless world facilitates rather than blocks. Look at it like a blank canvas rather than an empty glass. We can look to impose a meaning upon a world without any meaning, rather than passively allowing a meaning to be pushed onto us by someone else. Suffering might be meaningless, but it is up to you to provide it with some meaning in whatever way you see fit. Favaro believes this mask is the mask of the anti-hero, like Batman, who goes through the tragic event in his childhood of witnessing the senseless killing of his parents in an alleyway by a stray criminal. Bruce Wayne dies in that moment, and the new identity of Batman is born. Bruce Wayne sees his suffering meaninglessly and decides he will change Gotham no matter what. He fully adopts the identity of Batman, unlike Superman, and is attempting to impose his meaning onto the world through order and justice as he sees it. In most graphic novel portrayals of Batman, Bruce Wayne is just a shell and Batman is the real identity. Bruce Wayne just becomes this useful fake identity for Batman to use. Alfred is kind of his only connection to Bruce Wayne and society as his butler and his surrogate father. But Batman lives in the absolutes of his fully realized mask. That is the point at which he becomes the anti-hero, because he completely becomes his new identity, and he does so outside of the borders of society. He is not looking to maintain the order of society, but wishes to impose his ideas and his meaning onto the world, which he has realized through the tragedy they experienced as a child. But it's important to remember, Batman and Superman live in the same world. They merely adopt different approaches. Superman is this all-powerful, nearly god, who could change reality if he so pleased, but doesn't because he sees himself as inhabiting that moral code of society that Clark Kent lives within. He has this balanced view of things. Batman is just a man, admittedly unimaginably rich, who goes about imposing his will onto the world around him, while also being deeply disconnected from the society he lives in. Batman functions on the absolutes. There is a strange duality to their shared existence. So the distinction between these two is now a little bit more clear, even philosophically, but we still haven't really answered something. If they're so different, what brings about their friendship?
Batman, it's really you! Am I missing something?
So before we can really answer that, it's helpful for us to understand societally What changed between the superhero and the anti-hero beyond the change of just the comic to the graphic novel? Now, the original superhero came about in the industrialized society where office work and labor had placed men into repetitive conditions, but on a wider level, from the 1930s to the 80s in America, you had World War II and the Cold War raging in the American psyche. American society was placed in contrast to the horrors of fascism and to the internal perceptions of the evil Soviet Union. So it's unsurprising we see these heroes who go about saving American society from villains who threaten the stable American way of life. But in the 80s to the 90s, as the Berlin Wall falls, the news of Watergate is broken out to the average public, the Vietnam War finally ends, and in the midst of a neoliberal economic transformation from Reagan to Clinton to Bush, America completely changes, and the American view of themselves also deeply changes. So graphic novels come at a time when the threat of an external enemy to American society is waning. People are losing faith in their institutions, their politicians, who they feel have betrayed them during some of the actions that have happened beforehand. And they're going through an economic transformation, which is going to further destroy social bonds and communities and increase a feeling of individualism and a corresponding loneliness. It's no surprise these graphic novels then have anti-heroic characters who start to look at the society which once had simple superheroes and begins to ask some pretty cutting questions about their own society. Watchmen is a fantastic example of this. It's one of the quintessential graphic novels of the Dark Age, and is about a world where supervillains have kind of disappeared. The superheroes are older and are questioning their actions of the past and their own heroism, and the story has a specific anti-hero in Rorschach who completely adopts the identity of his mask and lives by a ridiculously strict moral code, following his encounter with a not very nice person that drives him to realize the dark evils lurking deep within his own society. But it should be noted, these anti-heroes are not generally to be purely praised, and usually their stories don't purely praise them, with Rorschach coming off as completely insane in Watchmen. He is a product of the Nietzschean mask gone wrong. He believes in his own worldview so strongly that he will impose it upon others without any thought towards the complexities that might be involved. We can see this as the product of a certain moral relativism, which says that their tragedy is always an excuse to impose tragedy upon others. They view all actions outside of their own moral position as being completely equally evil, as they live in the absolutes of their own mask and the meaninglessness of the world around them. They're a particular concoction of our time, same way the traditional superhero represented the America of their time. The anti-hero can commit to changing things, but seems to do so on an individualistic basis. As they look at a corrupted world around them which they've completely disconnected themselves from, they start treating that world like a blank canvas in the worst possible way. They see the meaninglessness from their tragic experience, and they decide to completely disconnect themselves from the world around them and just purely individualize inside of themselves. If the tragic superhero is a perfect civic consciousness, the anti-hero gone wrong is the lack of any consciousness outside of oneself. They see themselves as disconnected from anything in the meaningless world around them. And this comes through in most anti-heroic tales as they present society in this completely moral decay, at least from the anti-hero's perspective. And it's only the anti-hero's unique moral view which makes sense in the world gone mad. Due to this, they feel like they can impose themselves freely anywhere, the same way the world imposed itself onto them freely beforehand. But sometimes they don't make any distinction between what actually caused their own suffering and those who were the victim of meaningless suffering just like they were. Let's think about the group who mostly read these anti-heroic graphic novels. Young men. A group who have notoriously felt like they are losing their traditional place in society, are becoming more disconnected from traditional social ties, and are feeling more lonely. Too often now have they looked at the anti-hero as a solution to these problems by indulging in this completely disconnected individual consciousness, as they see society as a place to recklessly impose meaning, to provide meaning to their own suffering, but oftentimes being led astray by bad faith actors who are trying to convince them of their own worldview. And these people will say that young men can find meaning if they have, say, an unrestricted obsession with money accumulation, or their life will have meaning if they can impose law and order onto others. And in the worst case scenario, some of these young men move in the most brutal direction they can, where they seek to impose meaning by actively harming anyone around them, as they have disconnected themselves so far from society that everyone in society becomes a target. And it should be said, these graphic novels are not causing this issue. They are simply a product of the time, and they simply speak to how certain people are possibly feeling right now in society. But I would like to suggest an alternative to this that maybe could be helpful. That would be that those people who feel this connection to this anti-heroic sentiment of pure individualism and pure individual consciousness, maybe instead they can go about providing meaning through the realization that they are one of a collection of groups who've experienced other kinds of trauma at the hands of the same systems. To put it more explicitly, if young men have suffered due to their changing, say, societally imposed gender role, then they need to understand that they share that same suffering with women as well, who are also suffering from their own imposed gender roles. If young men are feeling the burden of changing economic systems, then they need to go through the realization that they share in that suffering with all the people in that same economic system. Basically, I'm suggesting that it requires a political consciousness of how we are affected by the systems around us and how changing that system together might act to impose some meaning upon that suffering that they feel. And moving forward by planning how we might bring about a change where that suffering will have been worth something. Inspiring a heroism which changes the world not on an individualistic basis, but on a collective one, in which we can all give each other's suffering meaning. And to leave this on a strange note, possibly, Batman vs. Superman, the movie, is a bit of a shit show, but it does present this almost Nietzschean portrayal of two heroes who have gone off the deep end of their own ideologies, imposing their worldview onto those around them in a seemingly terrifying manner. Superman has wrecked a city and snapped a man's neck in his pursuit of peace, while Batman has become disillusioned to the point that he freely kills others in his attempt to impose his ideas of order upon the world around him. But the moment which prevents them from taking another step in that process of imposing themselves onto the world by killing each other, they both go through the realization that they both have been shaped by their suffering and how they have brought meaning to their lives because of it. Batman in the shape of his mother, who he lost to a cruel act of disorder, and Superman in the fear of losing his adopted mother like he lost his real mother, Martha.